Well, hello everyone, and welcome to week 23 of World History as we get deeper and deeper into the Age of Reformation, and not very far from being able to put that in the rear view mirror. We're going to have, as usual, three lessons this week. We're going to start off with a man that you probably have not heard of. He's one of these educational reformers and thinkers that was very active during his time, but not fully appreciated until much later, and really I would say only in the last couple of generations have we truly began to accurately measure his impact on the Western way of education. His name is John Amos Comenius, called the father of modern education. He was a member. He was a victim of bad timing. He lived in the Czech Republic in Prague right when the 30 Years War started with the defenestration. You remember, tossing from the windows in Prague. Comenius, of course, the Catholics really had their sights set on Prague. In the first part of the 30 Years War, Prague was the scene of a lot of battles, and Comenius was forced to live on the run pretty much perpetually after that. He left the area of Moravia, which is sort of the modern day Western Czech Republic near Germany. And unfortunately, when he left in 1618, he would never set foot again. He always seemed to be under attack by the prevailing Protestant rulers, or Catholic rulers most notably. But he ended up in 1632 published some of his ideas about learning. He was a teacher, kind of a jack of all trades, but he saw the way education was being delivered, and he thought it was inefficient, and particularly to children we're talking about. And again, at this time, recall, it was not as bad as it used to be in the medieval period, talking about illiteracy. But still, at this point, about 80% of Europe was functionally illiterate. They could not read or write, so only 20% of the education is being educated to any real degree. He said education was narrow, impractical, and hard to find. And he thought all three of these should be changed. Very big on everyone getting an education, regardless of their class. He thought that education should be available to all children, no matter rich or poor, and also male and female. Not everyone thought that at this point, but he thought little boys and little girls should all be educated. He thought it should be realistic and use concrete objects or nature whenever possible to try to teach abstract things. He was a Christian. And Christianity was a very big part of his educational philosophy, but he thought that there were a lot of real-world examples that could try to teach some of these greater truths that are sometimes intangible. He thought education should include the training of the body as well as the mind through outdoor play and sports. In short, he was the first to advocate what we would call a recess, particularly with younger kids. You can see from around school, the younger kids got a whole lot of energy they got to get out of them sometimes. He thought education, in its essence, should be practical and teach things that will help with the business of ordinary everyday life, basically training for life. But it also, in doing that, should bless the student with an ability to think. Because things are going to be very different after school. Things are always changing throughout your life. You should be able to think about all things. Whether or not you come to the right conclusion, doesn't matter. But education should teach you to think. Education should include the study of science. Again, oddly enough, not everyone believed that at that point. And he thought, in the end, at its best, education should improve one's character and produce happiness for that person and for others. He thought that obedience to God was above all, but he had very strong ideas about education. He thought parents were a very pivotal role in that early on. Parents have to be very attentive to their children to make them ready to learn. He looked at education as more than just the recitation of facts, and rather as a method for learning how to think. It's great that you know the Battle of Hastings was fought in 1066. You do know that, right? But why is that important? Can you answer that question? Why is the Battle of Hastings important, and why is it important that you know why it's important? 1066 is just the date it occurred. The news here is what happened and why it's important, even in today's age. Comenius pretty much wandered the rest of his life. Again, it was just a sad existence, it seemed. He just went from place to place publishing things about education. People were adopting them, good ideas, but again, he was never comfortable. He eventually settled in Sweden, and at the age of 64, he actually pulled up out of Sweden and went to Holland and wrote some more. He put together the first textbook for children called the Orbis Pictus, The World in Pictures. He, again, based on the belief that concrete objects, or at least pictures of them, would be helpful in teaching abstract things. His book had more pictures than words in it. Again, he knew that children learned visually before they could learn in other ways. Your sense of sight and sound are two of the first things you develop, even at an unconscious level. And Comenius said that at a very early age, children are much more responsive to visual stimuli. To teach about the concept of justice, he came up with a picture, an image, a drawing of a lady holding a pair of scales to teach the idea that justice weighs out what's fair. In the picture, this woman is also shown blindfolded to teach that justice should not be influenced by what is seen with the eyes. You should not judge a book by its cover, so to speak. And so this image of a blindfolded woman holding a set of scales became known as Lady Justice. And in all of his books, Lady Justice represented the otherwise abstract concept of justice. And of course, it stuck around and is part of Western culture today. Again, Comenius's theories on education are so obvious to us, but they were not obvious in the 17th century. So, even 500 years after his death, he is really, or 400 years after his death, he's really just now being recognized really as the father of modern education. We've got to go back to jolly old England and pick up kind of where we left off. We went through Elizabeth, of course, after her death, the rest of James I on the throne of England, then Charles I. We're getting into a pretty bloody part of British history here. We're going to look at the English Civil Wars, and were really two different ones. We're going to focus on the first one today. Lasted roughly from 1642 to 1651. It was not a civil war insofar as it was a series of battles on the battlefield, two armies clashing multiple times. It was a lot of physical skirmishes, but a lot of the fighting of the Civil War was not warfare. It was political posturing, forming alliances and whatnot, but it was basically idea of two different philosophies. The current king, Charles I, was a big idea of what he called the divine right of kings. That means that he saw himself as a godly appointee, and whatever he said was the law. The king was the law. The king can do no wrong. That's the sort of the divine right of kings. Now, you'll recall 400 years earlier, the English as a people, began to question this when the nobles forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. Idea behind the Magna Carta was the king is not God. The king is fallible. There are some things even kings cannot do. There are some things with which the kings cannot get away with just because they're kings. So 400 years later, you've got a king in place that likes this idea of the king being an absolute monarch. The English, though, again, at this point in history, they'd had 400 years worth of at least the nominal idea that the king was not a god. So this strong arming by Charles I did not play well with the British people, particularly the lawmakers in Parliament. Again, Parliament was established post Magna Carta, of course, as basically an advisory body to the king. But over the 400 years, they had been getting a little bit more authority. Again, collectively, British people were getting away from this idea of king as God. And then here comes Charles I, wanting to act like a god. Well, it divided people very sharply. Charles I actually called Parliament into session and then gave them no agenda. So they were legally in session for like 20 years. It's a kind of a sidebar type story. He ignored Parliament. He did things on his own. He raised taxes on his own. He's not supposed to do that. He spent money on some religious wars. Again, he was very Catholic, and he wanted to bring Britain back under Catholic rule. The divisions in Parliament, meantime, became so serious that they really split into two broad factions, Cavaliers and Roundheads. In short order, the Cavaliers supported the crown. They were royalists. They were often very wealthy landowners and nobles who the king's power protects their holdings, and so they owe a great deal of gratitude to the crown, the king, whoever it may be. Cavaliers were notable by their foppish dress, long curly hair. They were the aristocrats. These were the blue bloods. The Roundheads, though, were those that opposed the idea of the divine right of kings. They were very big on parliamentarian process. The Roundheads were called that because a lot of them had sort of the commoner's haircut, which was more or less a bowl-shaped haircut. It was a derogatory term at first, but the Roundheads were usually Puritan. They strayed away from the foppish look of the Cavaliers, and they were very much at odds with the king and the idea of a monarchy that had delusions of godhood. The First English Civil War started in 1642. Each side had about 1,000 men. As time went on, more and more got involved. The Cavaliers recruited their own armies. The Roundheads started swelling in numbers. The Cavaliers recruited other nobles, Irishmen, Catholics from across the region. 10% of the English population died over the next decade. That's one of the worst war casualty figures you will hear in terms of deaths. 10% of the English population died in their 9-year-long Civil War, kind of splitting between battle and battle. In 1643, the second year of the war, the Scottish joined the fighting. They gave help to the Roundheads because they held similar religious views. The Presbyterians in Scotland had been treated very badly under Charles I. At the Battle of Naseby in 1645, the Cavaliers were weakened. Charles I was defeated. He was forced to flee to Scotland. He tried to make peace with the Scots while there and rally them back to his side, but that did not work. The Scottish did not trust the Catholic King Charles, and they really didn't have any reason to. By 1648, though, Charles was able to find enough allies, Catholic and otherwise, and was able to start what was called the Second English Civil War. This lasted only about a year. Charles and his armies were routed. The Roundheads were the winners. He was captured, was Charles, handed over to the English, who proceeded to arrest the king of their nation. All right. January 30th, 1649, Charles was beheaded in front of the Palace of Whitehall. A clear message that the English were not going to tolerate an absolute monarch or any kind of a dictator on the throne. Kings are not often killed by their people. That's a very rare event. It's happened before elsewhere. But you can imagine what England was like at this point. For the first time in 500 years, they did not have a sitting king. Well, enter a man named Oliver Cromwell, one of the more prominent Roundheads who had some military victories. He was born into an ordinary Puritan family, and He was both a Puritan and a parliamentarian, very much at odds with the idea of a supreme ruler as king. He was notably puritanical in his army. You weren't allowed to curse or drink or to have other types of fun as a member of his army. They sang the Psalms of David while in battle, so Cromwell was a pretty outwardly religious fellow. As it turned out, he had a revengeful streak, a deadly one. 1649, he led his troops against the Irish. Again, Irish Catholics had supported the Cavaliers and Charles I. Cromwell set out to punish them for that. And through an attack on Ireland, it was called the Cromwellian Conquest, but it was basically a massacre. Troops attacked civilians or ordinary people in addition to the armies. In one town, Droghted, in 1652, two-thirds of their property was put in the hands of Englishmen after that town was sacked. By 1652, over 600,000 Irish residents were dead from either war, plague, or starvation. According to Cromwell, it was God's judgment. For others, it was a sign of this guy's vindictiveness. Now again, he was outwardly Puritan. Remember, oh gosh, I don't know, back the Pilgrims, remember when we talked about them? They were separatists, but others, Puritans, had been persecuted by Catholics for decades. So what happens the second when the Puritans get power? Again, this is what happens when you merge the crown and the cross, when you give governmental authority to someone based on their religion. Bad things. The oppressed become the oppressors because they're going to wield this newfound power. Happens all the time. Meantime, Cromwell's leadership grew. He helped lead Parliament, establishing the Commonwealth, which England is still called today. He called the new government he formed a protectorate of England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. And the title of Lord Protectorate of England, Scotland, and Ireland fell to, you guessed it, Oliver Cromwell. He put a lot of Puritan ideas in place. Again, Puritans for years had been marginalized by Catholic kings in England. Now they're going to get their revenge. They got it in Ireland in a very bloody way. On the mainland UK, they closed theaters, forced shops to close on Sunday. These orders were written on blue paper, blue notification, and plastered in the town square. Because they were blue, these became known as blue laws, and they were very popular in the U.S., really, until the 70s and 80s. Shops were closed again. Sports and games were forbidden. The Puritans, after being the oppressed, were now the oppressors. Legislating living, the Puritans did about as well as any other group. It's very hard to legislate religion and morality. You might be able to get them to behave like you want to, but you won't change their hearts. And the only thing that saves us is the Spirit of God, not the things we do. Oliver Cromwell kept his position for 15 years. He, again, managed to tick off a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. He gave freedom to some and persecuted others. He faced more war than he ended up stomaching. He started trouble with Holland and Scotland. As he went on and as the English monarchy reformed, we'll talk about that later, Oliver Cromwell was one of those who died with an okay reputation, but years after, when the extent of his power and his abuse of power was revealed, he was very much despised after his death, the more we learned about him. History did not treat Oliver Cromwell kindly, nor should it have. We're going to close out with a couple of words on the guy called the first modern chemist. His name is Robert Boyle. He was an Irish scientist who moved to England in 1645, and he loved the Lord and he loved science. Unlike a lot of scientists, he saw God and science as inseparable. He said, the more I study science, the more I realize there's a wonderful God who set this amazing system up. And To me, that's kind of the way I look at it. Anyway, that's another story. But Robert Boyle was one who was able to seamlessly navigate the worlds of science and religion. He was actually fairly well off. His father left him with an estate in Ireland, and he used that to study his passion, which was science. He formed what he called the Invisible College in London, a group of like-minded eggheads who would get together and informally just kind of talk shop, really. It became the Royal Society of London, and in 1654, and it still exists today. It's one of the world's most prestigious, I don't know what you call it, think tank, where ideas are bandied about, great and small. But anyway, Robert Boyle was one of the founding members of the Royal Academy of London. He was the first scientist to really discover that the difference between so-called compounds and elements. For a long time, everyone, the science, said that all matter was one of four things. It was either air, fire, water, or earth. Well, Boyle said, yes, but you can break it down even further. And he broke down really what we call elemental science, the idea that all matter is composed of the smallest of possible particles called atoms. And every time two hydrogen atoms meet with one oxygen atom, that means water. He was also he was sold on the idea of alchemy, and again, like everyone else, he was trying to find a way to make gold. But as his own studies would show later, gold could not be created. It is an element in and of itself. Gold cannot be broken down into a different material, nor can other materials be combined to create gold. His biggest contribution to law, though, was called Boyle's Law. It simply means at a constant temperature, the volume of a fixed amount of gas varies inversely with pressure. That means that the pressure goes up, the volume of gas goes down, and vice versa. What does this mean? Well, an awful lot when you're talking about, internal combustion engines later, steam-powered engines, which were a direct result of Boyle's studies and laws. He used the scientific method to back up all of his findings, and he took great notes. Therefore, because of these contributions, he's remembered as the first modern chemist. But again, noteworthy for Boyle was his belief that all of the science in the world is further proof that there is a God and that this God loves us. Interesting conclusion. We'll talk more about it on Monday. See you then.